everyone. Our presentation is about women's education from past to present. I'm Sabah.
I'm Hasleen.
I'm Mona, and our fourth member is Lillian.
And that is me.
We chose this topic because even though we do see this improvement from the past, but we still see discrimination among men and women in various fields. Usually in response to men's achievement, we hear that they worked hard and deserved it. However, if a woman has a similar achievement, instead of giving her credits, we often hear that she gained it by chance. Some of the fields that we see discrimination between women and men are in education, for example, in STEM majors. In workplace, such that we see a lot more men than women in construction fields. Also in politics, we see fewer women than men in governmental cabins. Even in sports and among professional athletes, we do see discrimination. One example is that Katinka Hasu, who is a professional swimmer and won a gold medal in Rio Olympics. But instead of giving her credits for her victory, the NBC announcer gave the credit to her husband, who was also her coach for the time, and stated that the man responsible for record-breaking performance. And lastly, we do see discrimination among women and men in our everyday lives. For example, women are more concerned about when and with whom they should go out, and for how long they should stay outside. In our presentation, first we will cover a brief history of women's education, and then a journey of women's education from past to present, factors influencing women's involvement, women's expectations, our view of women in the future, and a conclusion. Now, I will introduce some of the successful women in the history of Canada. First, Emily Howard Stowe was the first woman to practice medicine in Canada in 1868. Grace Annie Lockhart in 1875 was the first woman to receive a university degree in Canada. Jenny Kittrout in 1875, she was the first Canadian woman licensed to practice medicine. Anne Augusta Stowe Gulen was the first woman to get her medical degree in Canada in 1883. Harriet Brooks. She got her degree in 1888 and became the first woman nuclear physicist in Canada. Carolyn Louise Josephine Wells was the first one to get a dental degree in Canada in 1893. Clara Brett Martin in 1897, she was the first woman lawyer in the British Empire. Jane Robertson in 1911 became the first woman to perform surgery in Canada. Minerva Ellen Reid. She was the first woman chief of surgery in North America in 1915. Esther Marjorie Hill in 1920. She was the first woman to enter and gain a degree in architecture. Vera Parsons. After passing the bar in 1924, she became the first woman criminal defense lawyer in Ontario and the first woman to appear in court before a judge and jury in Canada. Eileen Rolick. In 1928, she became the first woman to earn a private pilot certificate in Canada. Leila Wetman, after the death of her husband in 1947, she became the first woman to own a company in Canada. Veena Rawat, in 1974, she was the first woman in Canada to get her PhD in electrical engineering. Marian Ironquill Nedmore. In 1977, she was the first Indigenous woman lawyer in Canada. Elizabeth McRae. In 1982, she became the first Canadian woman neurosurgeon. Ursula Martius Franklin. In 1984, she was the first woman to become a professor at the Faculty of Engineering in Canada.
The journey from past to present, women's representation in post-secondary education has significantly improved. In 1990, 26% of post-secondary graduates in Canada were women. In 2008, 68% of post-secondary graduates in Canada were women. However, women are still at a disadvantage. Women are still underrepresented in fields of math, science, and engineering despite the increase. They also tend to have less opportunities, job searching after graduation. In the STEM fields, they face discrimination and are seen as less competent. This is in part due to social constructions and cultural views such as gender roles, gender stereotypes, discrimination, male dominance, etc. Cultural views and norms. Sexual assault and violence. Sexual assault rates are high on the university and college campuses. 1 in 4 women report rape or attempt of rape, and many go unreported or are not taken seriously. For instance, Harry Weinstein has numerous sexual assault allegations against him, which women have just recently began coming out for. Women are more hesitant to go on campus or stay at the library after 7 p.m., therefore, they do not get the same opportunity to study. In self-confidence, studies show that women are less confident in their abilities of STEM-related classes. Girls tend to be underconfident with their mathematical performance, whereas boys tend to be overconfident. This affects women's confidence in the economic skill level. Women are less confident of their abilities and also to ask for credit and raises less. What influences women's disadvantage are violence and poverty. Women are at a disadvantage when it comes to education, employment, politics, sports, and everyday life. There is very little space for women to be successful in education. The violence that's inflicted upon women are so that in most cases, men were responsible for a majority of violence committed against women. In fact, 83% of the violence committed against women are inflicted upon by men. In Canada, sexual exploitation through sex trade is more prevalent than forced labor. Women are disproportionately the victims of this crime, youth and Indigenous women particularly. Something else that influences women's success in education is poverty. Women's lower earning power means that they are at high risk of falling into poverty if they have children and then become separated, divorced, or widowed. The risk of falling into poverty means that some women stay in abusive relationships despite the danger. Even though working women has increased from 42% to 60% over the last 3 decades, the Canadian government has failed to respond to this, which leaves women at an incredible disadvantage.
I am going to address my slide presentation on the current and future involvement of women in the world and how their efforts count. A quote in development circle is, if you educate a man, you educate 1%. If you educate a woman, you educate a nation. By educating women, the benefits spread throughout their communities. An educated woman can educate her own children. Educated women understand the value of nutrition, and by taking care of herself, babies are born healthier. Julia Gillard explained, just 1 extra year of secondary education can increase a woman's income as much as 25% a year. It is also a fact that the educated women are less likely to become victims of human trafficking, child marriage, and prostitution. Childbirth. Obviously a woman's problem. In the Western world, flex time, working from home, and child care help. Underdeveloped countries have still to overcome. Glass ceiling. This term comes from the business world where men get preferential promotion, partly caused by childbirth. Women do not have children are often able to overcome this barrier. Women and medical advances. Science has provided women with the ability to make choices on motherhood. Information is available on nutrition, wellness, and the kind of physical activities that can promote health. Second-class citizens, male domination, and religious dictates. In many of the underdeveloped countries, women are still considered second-class citizens. Culture ensures that they get no education and are subjected to outdated religious dogma. Mothers also perpetuate cultural tradition. Religious leaders also tend to force the status quos. An example is the Catholic Church's stand on birth control and abortion. Supporting women in business. Some years ago, Muhammad Yunus started banking system to support poor women. These were small loans ignored by the bank. Yunus's system has helped many women create cottage industries. Technology and its benefits. Educated women can work computers and online job opportunities. The entertainment business also uses technology. Physical disadvantages. These are mostly based on strength and stamina. These can be enhanced by training and technological aid. However, women do have physical advantages as well. The benefits of education and equality enable women to hope. We have many examples of successful women in politics, business, and science. In the future, with education, equality, and technology, there are no limits. Women will be able to work from their homes or outside, care for their own children, or hire others. It has already been proven by people like Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher, and Hillary Clinton. When we look at the inequalities in the world, the differences between Western and similar nations and the Third World nation, we see how women are affected. Education and lack of religious domination make all the differences. In our own country, we find the difference between the indigenous women who have had abusive past in the so-called residential schools, combined with the lack of decent formal education and forced religious changes, and the settlers from the educated countries. It is to be hoped that the future will realize the truth in if you educate a man, you educate one person. If you educate a woman, you educate a nation.
Good evening. My name is Lillian Jones, and I want to have an informal conversation with you about intergenerational trauma. I'm going to read to you what I have written so that we can begin that conversation. There are Indigenous students in schools across Canada who are displaying signs of intergenerational trauma. The signs these students display consist of the following, but are not limited to: being constantly hungry, angry, sad, and tired. They often don't produce any work for their teacher. Their behaviors aren't appropriate to school conduct, which would mean that they're in the office regularly. They don't shower or wear clean clothes. The parental guardian involvement in their education is lacking. Their attendance rate is poor. They struggle in their learning so much that they are amongst the many who get pushed through grades without the skill set of each grade. Therefore, the gap in their learning becomes greater as each school year passes. At school, the challenges for Indigenous students suffering from intergenerational trauma are there aren't enough administrators and educators who have an awareness of trauma and how to intervene. The risk of re-victimizing children is greater when there is no awareness. At home and in the community, The challenges are a lack of awareness of the generational trauma and the need for healing and support for all families. Intervention is needed everywhere. What type of intervention is appropriate for schools? Awareness is the first intervention. People need to create safe space for conversation about the trauma that shows up in classrooms in order to understand the students who are suffering from trauma. Vanessa Andreotti discusses conversation styles in a class lecture. She explains that there are people who only dip their toes in when discussing matters. There are people who float on the water, so to speak, and offer only manageable solutions. And there are people who duck into issues but keep their hands above the water for safety measures. Then there are people who dive into conversations with no fear of losing their job. They aren't afraid of depth, and they aren't sure of what will come out of their effort, but they go forth anyway. It's going to take people who are willing to dive into conversations of intergenerational trauma in order to intervene in the lives of traumatized children and offer them the change that they are waiting for. What is intergenerational trauma? In short, intergenerational trauma is trauma handed down from generation to generation. In 1876, Indigenous peoples' suffering began. Children were violently taken from their homes and physically and sexually tortured in schools, while being forced to do physical labor and offered very little time to learn to read, write, and speak English. These children weren't allowed to speak their language, and if they did, severe punishment occurred. They were able to go home to their families during vacations if their families were still alive. Many parents and grandparents died of depression from the loss of their children. And the parents and grandparents that were alive were so depressed from losing their children that often they would be suffering from addiction, like alcoholism or substance abuse. So they weren't able to nurture and welcome their children home. Residential school survivors went on to have children of their own once they left those schools. They repeated a lot of what happened to them, to their children, therefore, or hence, the intergenerational trauma. They abandoned their children at the same age they went to the schools, for instance. They physically and sexually abused their children just as it had been done to them. And the way they spoke to their children was one of disgust, just as the residential school teachers had spoke to them in. Trauma became normal. Britzman, D., and Feldman question, in a post-traumatic century that has survived unthinkable historical catastrophes, is there anything that we have learned or that we should learn about education that we did not know before? Indigenous peoples have been suffering with trauma for 141 years thus far. If people haven't known that, it's time that people know that. The call to intervene is so loud. Intervention can become the new normal. Britzman asks, what inhibits our capacity to respond ethically to others, to learn something from people we will never meet, and to be affected by histories that we may never live? There's no more time to be afraid to respond. One possible way forward is through decolonization. Donald explains the process of decolonizing in Canada on a broad scale, and especially in educational context, can only occur when Aboriginal people and Canadians face each other across deeply learned divides, revisit and deconstruct their shared past, and engage carefully with the realization that their past and future are similarly tied together. The way people choose to go forward isn't of concern. The concern is that people start to move forward together. It's urgent. Children are hurting right now. Children need safe adults with consistency and patience. Todd echoes that teachers can desire certain changes in their students, but students' lives change in unpredictable ways outside of these desires. Administrators and educators need to learn to journey with Indigenous students along a path of education, learning, healing, and support. Vanessa Andriotti, in a class lecture, describes what learning to walk together differently can look like. Walking together differently in a foggy road means that we're listening, engaging, tentatively framing, failing, falling, learning, reframing, crying, laughing, singing, sharing, experimenting, stumbling, making mistakes, listening, trying new clothes, getting naked, being undone, drumming, dancing, resting, starting all over again. Indigenous children are waiting for us to start this process. Stein et al. Confirmed that when promises no longer or never did seem credible, young people respond accordingly. Rising levels of depression, anxiety, and self-harm among youth can be read as signs of painful mismatch between the promises of opportunity and incremental happiness sustained by schools and the realities of the precarious present and the uncertain future. Children need support and love in their homes and in their communities, as well as in school. Parents, grandparents, educators, and frontline workers need support to offer safe space to these students. The possibility for safe space is there. The call is yet to be answered. Gaztambi Fernandez states that educators are being called upon to play a central role in constructing the conditions for a different kind of encounter. An encounter that both opposes ongoing colonization and that seeks to heal the social, cultural, and spiritual ravages of colonial history. This call requires abandoning the traditional logics of formal schooling that have defined educational projects over the last 2 centuries. It doesn't mean that children are talking about their trauma in school, or that teachers are encouraging them to do so. It means that children are given space to become calm when they arrive at school in a state of trauma. It's impossible to learn when one feels as though their life is being threatened. Dr. Bruce Perry explains, "One of the greatest lessons I've learned in my work is the importance of simply taking time before doing anything else to pay attention and listen. Because of the mirroring neurobiology of our brains, one of the best ways to help someone else become calm and centered is to calm and center ourselves first, and then just pay attention." When you approach a child from this perspective, the response you get is far different from when you simply assume that you know what is going on and how to fix it. I also cannot emphasize enough how important routine and repetition are to recovery. The longer the period of trauma, or the more extreme the trauma, the greater the number of repetitions required to regain balance. I offer this informal video to you or to administrators and educators and the Ministry of Education as a way that we can think about how to help Indigenous students succeed in education. I think there are lots of amazing endeavors that are going forward. For instance, Aboriginal content in the curriculum, that's amazing. The Truth and Reconciliation has calls to action that have yet to be answered. And my informal conversation is a way that you possibly could look at answering a call. And so what I mean by that is you're constantly daily going to encounter children in trauma, and you're constantly welcome to intervene in their lives by giving them love and support and not pushing them to do academic work if they arrive in that state, to give them that space to calm down. And again, it's not that you're getting them to speak about the trauma, that you're just giving them that safe space, and constantly, over and over, giving them that safe space so that they can trust that that'll be there no matter what is happening at home or in their communities. And then at home in their community, my prayer is that we as Indigenous people will be able to help in that way, because again, home and community is our job, and at school your job could be being really sensitive and really loving. And as an intergenerational survivor myself, who often doesn't feel safe in the education system, offering you this as a way forward, as some help. Hi, for listening.